Thank you for coming today. Today I was going to talk about the two teachers that I had, Suzuki Roshi and Katagiri Roshi. I met them both in San Francisco. And Suzuki Roshi, the term Roshi means, it's an honorific term meaning old teacher. And Suzuki Roshi, his name was Shunryu Suzuki, and Katagiri Roshi, his name was Dainin Katagiri. And Suzuki Roshi came from Japan to San Francisco in 1959. He had been asked to come there and lead a Japanese congregation there in San Francisco. And Katagiri Roshi, when he first came to America, was in 1963, and he came to help a group in Los Angeles. But after about 5 months there, he was able to transfer up to San Francisco and work as an assistant teacher with Suzuki Roshi. So these were my two teachers when I started out in Zen. And Suzuki Roshi is very well known for the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and other books as well, but that's the book for which he is most famous. And also he established the San Francisco Zen Center and also the monastery at Tassajara, which was, Tassajara was, before the Zen Center bought it, had been a resort. It was Tassajara Hot Springs, but the San Francisco Zen Center purchased it, and it became the monastery at Tassajara. And and then Katagiri Roshi, he came here after Suzuki Roshi died, and he helped the practice develop here in Minneapolis, and also he helped with establishing centers around the Midwest. So I'll start off talking about warm-hearted practice. Suzuki Roshi used to talk about warm-hearted practice. And I'll just read something about this. In this book, he talks about hearing a bird while he's studying in his room. Suzuki Roshi says, I may think the bird is singing over there, but when I hear the bird is me already. Actually, I am not listening to the bird. The bird is here in my mind already, and I am singing with the bird. If you think while you are studying, the blue jay is singing above my roof and his voice is not so good, then you are disturbed by the blue jay. When you are not disturbed by blue jays will be right in your heart, and you will be a blue jay, and the blue jay will be reading with you. And then the blue jay will not disturb your reading. When we think, the blue jay over my roof should not be there, he's bothering me. This thought is based on a superficial understanding of our life. And I had a friend when I was about 10 years old, and sometimes he would come with me and my parents when we go on camping trips. And almost every morning we'd be woken up by him throwing rocks at the blue jays. And he never hit one of the blue jays, but it wasn't for lack of trying, but he really hated blue jays. The screeching noise they made, and he just hated blue jays. But Suzuki Roshi might have said about him that he had a very superficial understanding of life and that he was in dire need of Zen practice. He might have said that. So Suzuki Roshi used to talk about warm-hearted practice. And this warm-hearted practice is not the usual idea of how we live our life. Usually we live our life based on our likes and dislikes and emotional preferences, caught up in our ideas about ourselves and others and what we like, what we dislike, and caught up in our ideas about how reality is. But he says when we live our life caught up in this way, this is a very unstable way of life. And a warm-hearted practice, according to Suzuki Roshi, is beyond our usual ideas based on our likes and dislikes and emotional preferences. In this practice, we don't try to get rid of our emotional preferences or feelings. This practice is not about making ourselves like everything. It's very natural to have feelings of like and dislike. For instance, usually people very much like flowers and hate weeds, and they're very pleased when the flowers bloom and the weeds die out, and they're very disappointed when the weeds flourish and the flowers die out. But we don't try to get rid of these feelings. Our practice is not about making ourselves like everything. It's very natural to like some things and not like another. So no matter how long I live, I doubt that I will ever like Limburger cheese. The reason I have very intense hatred of Limburger cheese, and the reason for that is when I was in high school, I was being initiated into a club, and part of the initiation was to torture us by hitting us with hard, huge paddles, hitting us on the seat with huge paddles, and making us chug Tabasco sauce and feeding us fistfuls of Limburger cheese. And I had never tasted anything so horrible as the Limburger cheese. It was the most god-awful thing I had ever experienced. I couldn't believe how horrible it was. And after the initiation, I asked one of the fellow people who was being initiated, I said, "What was that stuff?" And he said, "That's Limburger cheese. People spread it on their crackers and eat it." And I said, "You've got to be kidding. How would anybody ever eat that stuff, when they didn't have to eat it?" I thought it was something designed specifically for torturing people and initiation ceremonies. So I will never like Limburger cheese, but whether we like something or whether we dislike something isn't the point. It's just not to be caught by our preferences. Where it's the warm-hearted practice that Suzuki Roshi talks about goes beyond our personal preferences. And warm-hearted practice is based on the realization that we're living inseparably from all beings. Our life is the life of all beings. And we exist inseparably from whatever we meet. Although it seems to be otherwise, everything we meet is our own life. Each being is a universal being, and that it is a manifestation of the whole universe in which no separation can ultimately be found. Each being is manifesting universal life, the whole universe, in its own unique way. The universe manifests itself in such a way as to bring about the empty, illusory appearance of separate beings. We try to, in warm-hearted practice, we try to take care of ourselves and all the seemingly separate beings without being taken in by the belief that there actually are separate beings. This doesn't mean to ignore the appearance of separate beings. There definitely seem to be separate beings. But usually we live our life caught by that idea and think that that's the complete understanding of reality, that we're living in this world, this dualistically structured world of all these separate things. But in our practice, we can eventually realize that this, although it seems to be a dualistically structured reality, and this reality is a reality in which all beings are living inseparably from each other. This is the universal life, universal reality, which is our true life, our true self. It's also called Dharma, truth, reality, suchness, the one Buddha mind. These are different names for the true self or universal life, which is our true life. Our practice is to live as we truly are. Our practice is to live as universal life or the true self, and to take care of ourselves and others as universal life. We're all living one life with all beings. This is our true life, our true self. Our practice is to help each other beyond our likes and dislikes and emotional preferences, beyond our preconceived ideas about what our life is. This is to help each other beyond the idea of satisfying our individual desires. This is the warm-hearted practice that Suzuki Roshi would talk about. Sometimes to help others, we need to do things that we don't like. For example, parents have to change their children's diapers. I don't think anybody likes to do this, but if you're raising little children, babies, it's something you have to do. It's not something you like to do or want to do, but it's something you have to do to help your little baby. And Katagiri Roshi, who used to say that he hated sesshin. Sesshin is the meditation retreat of several days, up to a week in length, in which we do a lot of zazen. And he said he used to hate these sesshin, but he was the leader of the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center. And when the schedule was drawn up to sit sesshin, he is the leader of the group, had to sit sesshin with us. He didn't like doing it. It wasn't fun for him, but it was his job as leader of the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center. So sometimes we have to do things that we don't like to do. It's just, we don't like to do it, but yet in order to fulfill our duties and do what we need to do to help people in the way we need to help them, we have to do it. Suzuki Roshi, this was 4 months before he died. He was at Tassajara, the monastery at Tassajara. And he was there for about 1.5 months, and I was there at that time when he was there. And he worked very, very hard when he was there at Tassajara. He would give long 2-hour lectures at night without any preparation. He wouldn't do any preparation because he'd be so busy working with his students during the day, working in the kitchen, working in the fields, working in his rock garden. He was busy, kept himself busy all day working with his students. And so he didn't have any time for lecture preparation, but his lectures were beautiful, spontaneous lectures that were just wonderful to hear. But it must have been very difficult for him to do this, to work so hard and to go without any rest. But his wife was very concerned about him. He had been sick. We all knew he'd been sick the previous year, but we thought he was over that now. We thought he was okay now, but he wasn't completely over his sickness. And his wife knew that he was really pushing himself too hard. He shouldn't have been pushing himself too hard, she thought. And she would tell him, "You're cutting your life short by working so hard and spending so much time with your students." And Suzuki Roshi said, "If I don't cut my life short and spend this time with my students won't develop." So Suzuki Roshi knew he didn't have much time left. He died only 4 months later. But so he wanted to give it everything he had. And but his wife was very concerned about it. But he knew what he had to do. And he pushed himself very hard, even though it was probably very painful and difficult for him to do what he did. So both Katagiri Roshi and Suzuki Roshi had to do things that were unpleasant and difficult. But what we like and what we dislike are mixed up together. Can't exactly separate out what we like and what we dislike. They're all mixed up together. I mentioned that parents, they don't like changing their babies' diapers, but they have to do it. It's just part of their job as parents. One time when one of my grandsons was a toddler, I changed his diapers. He was really in dire need of having his diapers changed. He had a huge load in his diapers. When I went to change his diapers, I was confronted by this huge load. I said, "Yucky doodles." And then he said, "Yucky doodles." And then he reached up while I was changing his diapers. He reached up and grabbed my nose and he said, "I got your nose, Grandpa Norm." His other grandpa used to do this with him. He would grab his nose and say, "I got your nose." So he saw this as a great opportunity to grab my nose and say, "I got your nose, Grandpa Norm." So right in the midst of this activity, which is conventionally considered pretty unpleasant, there was this very wonderful, spontaneous, pleasant events that took place with my grandson. I mentioned that Katagiri Roshi didn't like sitting in the sesshin. But sometimes it was he'd when he'd give the lectures, he'd really get going, and he would really come up with spontaneous lecture presentations. It was really wonderful to hear him when he was doing this, and he himself seemed to be very joyful and delivered his lectures with great enthusiasm and joy, even though he was in the midst of an activity that was not fun for him, sitting a long sesshin with his students, but he joyfully appreciated the lectures. So what we like and what we dislike are mixed up together. Can't exactly separate out what we like, what it is that we like, and what we dislike. And Suzuki Roshi, although he was in pain and exhausted, he still seemed very joyful. He seemed very joyful that he had a chance to be together with us, and he had a chance to be with us and help us, even though it must have been very difficult physically for him to do it. His wife was very concerned about this, as I mentioned. And so sometimes when Suzuki Roshi would be working in his rock garden, he would have one of the guys working with him keep a lookout for his wife, So when she would go by, go down to the baths to wash clothes, he would sit down and pretend he was just supervising us, just resting, and she would go by. She looked at him. She looked at him kind of suspiciously, but then when she was gone, then he'd get up and work with us. He loved working in his rock garden. It was so much fun for him to do that. Couldn't help himself. These huge boulders would roll down off the mountain into the creek, and we'd bring these boulders with a truck and a winch. We'd bring them up to his rock garden, and then we would place them in his rock garden. And when he placed the rocks, he tried to place them so that they'd be in harmony with the rest of the environment. So he would look at the rock, he'd look up at the mountains, he'd look down at the creek, he'd look out at the fields, he'd look out at the flats in the other direction. He tried to really harmonize the placing of the rock with the whole environment. So he was a very little man. He was under 5 feet and probably weighed just maybe 90 pounds. But he could take these huge boulders and he'd look at it and study it. And then he'd move these huge boulders and he'd just push it in the right way and it would move. It was really quite remarkable how he could do that at his size. Us big Americans would try to muscle it around, and but he didn't have the muscle to do that. He would just look at it and he'd come to the conclusion that if you just pushed in this right spot, it would move, and it did. So it was really wonderful to watch him at work in his rock garden. So warm-hearted practice is just doing what needs to be done without being caught by ideas of pleasure, pain, likes or dislikes or difficulty. For both Katagiri Roshi and Suzuki Roshi, coming to America and trying to teach in English was very difficult for them. They'd both studied a little English before they came, but neither one of them were proficient in English before they came. It's very difficult for Katagiri Roshi. I remember at first he had a lot of trouble with it, but people were still inspired by his lectures, even though they couldn't always follow what he was saying. And I used to really enjoy his lectures too. I was working across the bay at the Berkeley post office, and I arranged to have my days off on Tuesday so I could come over to San Francisco Zen Center and listen to Katagiri Roshi's lectures on Tuesday night. And they were I was really inspired by them. Even though it was hard to understand what he was saying, he put so much effort in it and had this joyful enthusiasm in trying to get his point across. But still, it was pretty hard to understand what he said. But it didn't matter. It was just wonderful hearing him talk. And it took me about 2 or 3 months to figure out what he'd been talking about during his lecture series. I thought he was talking about Buddhist love. And I thought, wow, that's great, Buddhist love. I like that idea. But he hadn't been talking about that. He'd been talking about the Buddhist robe. And he would say, Buddhist robe. And I thought, Buddhist love. Wow, that's great. I like it. But it was Buddhist robe he was talking about. But it didn't matter, you know. To me, it was wonderful just to hear him talk on Tuesday nights. It was a highlight of my week, even though I wasn't understanding everything, but just to hear him enthusiastically and energetically trying to do these teachings, which were very difficult for him, very inspirational. He'd been talking about the Buddhist robe because there were several people that Suzuki Roshi was going to be ordaining, and they were sewing their robes, and they were going to have a ordination ceremony in a couple of months. So that led him to choose the topic of the Buddhist robe. Akatagiri Roshi eventually got better, but he still would make bloopers with his English. One time he said, don't measure things by your own stick yard. We looked around at each other. Stick yard? What does he mean, stick yard? And finally one person said, don't you mean yardstick, Roshi? And he said, oh, yes. And then he would start laughing. When he would make a blooper, he'd find it funnier than everybody else. And he'd start laughing. And then when he'd start laughing, everybody else would start laughing. And it really turned his lecture into a very joyful experience. And it energized the room. And people who might have been on the verge of falling asleep were suddenly energized and wide awake for the rest of the lecture. So his bloopers really enhanced his lectures, I think, and it made his lectures more interesting. Sometimes he would use the wrong word in a way that was much more beautiful than if he had known the right word to use. One time he was talking about the spark plugs of a car, but he called them the sparkling plugs. And when one time he was talking about teachings that were densely packed with meaning and significance, and he called them turgid, pithy teachings. You know, a person who spoke English as their natural language would never have used terms like that, but it just made his lectures more interesting and fun to listen to. There was a teacher in New York who Suzuki Roshi and Katagiri Roshi both got lessons to improve their English. And they tried very hard to speak English better. But there was a teacher in New York who didn't make any effort to improve his English. And he was from Japan, and his students were kind of irritated with him that he didn't make any effort to improve his English. One time, one of his students asked him, "What are you doing to improve your English? What program are you on to improve your English?" And he said, "I am on a very good program." And they said, well, what is that program? And he said, I learn one new English word a year. They're very irritated with him, though. But this teacher was really he was kind of a character, and he was actually a very good teacher. But he didn't try to speak too much in English. But Katagiri Roshi and Suzuki Roshi tried very hard to get better in English. Suzuki Roshi, in order to get better in English, he would sometimes watch baseball games on TV. And when he could see the action on the TV and hear the announcer speaking, he could learn some English that way. And although it was difficult for him at first, he got lots of lessons. Although it was difficult for him at first, eventually he got to the point where he had lots of fun using American expressions. He, one time in one of his lectures, he said, I recently heard the term, henpecked husband. It says the husband cannot raise his head because when he does, he gets beaten down by the hen. And Suzuki Roshi said, I am a henpecked husband. And then he went on to describe his relationship with his wife. He said, and he used another expression, American expression, to describe it. He said, I can't live with her, but I can't live without her. And he had a very impish sense of humor. One time, a person came to the San Francisco Zen Center to see Suzuki Roshi, came in the door and no one was there. He called out, Suzuki Roshi, no answer. Went upstairs and checked in the offices, saying Suzuki Roshi. Finally, he got to the last door in the upstairs hallway and he went in the room and there was Suzuki Roshi sitting with his hands back like this, with a big smile on his face. And Suzuki Roshi said, this must be the place. So he really had an impish sense of humor. He liked clowning around in a very friendly, non-threatening way. Sometimes he would, he knew us students at Tassajara, we were on kind of a low-fat diet there. And he knew that we were all fantasizing about hamburgers and banana splits. And so frequently in his lecture, he would mention about going out and getting a hamburger and a big banana split. I don't think he ever actually had those things himself, but he enjoyed teasing us about it. And his wife, Mrs. Suzuki, also had a very impish sense of humor. One time, some people went to the San Francisco Zen Center and the lights weren't on, the door was locked. And they knocked on the door and Mrs. Suzuki opened the upstairs window and she leaned out and said, Zazen is canceled today. Suzuki Roshi died. And all the students who had come to Zazen said, oh no, that's terrible. Suzuki Roshi died. That's awful. Oh my goodness. And then Mrs. Suzuki Roshi said, April Fool, American expression. So she had a real impish, puckish sense of humor too. But it was difficult coming to America for both Katagiri Roshi and Suzuki Roshi. This was a society that was so different from Japan. As I mentioned, Katagiri Roshi, when he first came here, went to Los Angeles to help out the teacher at the center in Los Angeles. And the teacher in Los Angeles said, if you live in Los Angeles, your life doesn't make any sense unless you have a car. And Suzuki or Katagiri Roshi had never driven before, so we had to buy a car and get driving lessons and get a license. And finally, he had a car, and so he'd go out. He'd have these teaching assignments in different parts of the city, and he'd go out trying to find these places. And but he couldn't read the maps because they were in English, and the road signs were in English. Too. He couldn't read them, so he'd pull over and ask somebody how to get to this destination, and because he'd get his instructions in English, he couldn't understand that either. So he'd just go back out there and keep driving and driving. And eventually he'd arrive at his destination, sometimes a couple of hours late. But he didn't get discouraged by this. He said, this was very different than my life in Japan. It was kind of an adventure for him. It was very difficult to get to these meetings late and not be able to find his way, but also it was kind of a fun adventure for him. And back in the 1960s, in 1959 was when Suzuki Roshi came to America. And this was, at this time, there were lots of wild Americans. They were beatniks. And they used to sit around coffee houses and talk about Zen. And a few years after the beatniks, there were the hippies. And the hippies were a pretty wild bunch themselves. And they would do all kinds of far out things. And anyway, at this time in America, there were the values that had been held for many decades, and the ways of life that had been followed for many decades were being questioned and changed, and many people were starting to adopt these new ways of life. And the epicenter of this was in San Francisco, and this was where the San Francisco Zen Center started up. So some very interesting situations arose here in this situation. Spontaneity was a very highly valued virtue among the hippies. And one time Katagiri Roshi went down to give Zazen instruction, and there saw a group of people down there in the meditation hall waiting for Zazen instruction. But with him was a man who was completely nude. And Katagiri Roshi said to him, "Why don't you put some clothes on?" And the man said, "I like to be in harmony with nature." So Katagiri Roshi just gave Zazen instruction to this group of people and this man who was in the nude. And but this was very different than the way things were in Japan. People didn't go to Japanese temples and sit Zazen in the nude. This was very different. And when the first training period I had at Tassajara, Suzuki Roshi had been sick that year and he wasn't able to lead the training period. So he asked a friend of his from Japan, Tatsugami Roshi, to come over and lead the training period. And so Tatsugami Roshi, he noticed that us Americans were kind of different in the way we did things. Americans deeply believed in the virtue of spontaneity, and this he extended to the virtue of spontaneous. I don't know if you call it a virtue, but it extended to spontaneously breaking the wind. This was something that we thought we should cultivate the virtue of spontaneity in all aspects of our life. But Tatsugami Roshi was astonished by this. They never did this in Japan. And one day in a lecture, he said, is spontaneously breaking the wind an American tradition? And this, Katagiri Roshi was translating this. We didn't, he said this in Japanese, and Katagiri Roshi was translating it. And suddenly, in the midst of the translation, when he got to this part, Katagiri Roshi started laughing uproariously, almost fell off his cushion. He was laughing so hard. And then later on, when Katagiri Roshi translated, then we all started laughing too. But anyway, it was very different coming to America and dealing with people who are so much different than those who had been in Japan, that they'd known in Japan. But these hippies and beatniks and had a very enthusiastic attitude about practice. They didn't have the preconceived ideas that a lot of the people in Japan did. They were willing to look at Zen in a fresh way. And this was something that both Katagiri Roshi and Suzuki Roshi were very, very pleased about. They had an opportunity to practice Zen with a beginner's mind and realize Zen practice and the Zen way of life in a completely fresh way. So they were very supportive of the hippies and beatniks and crazy Americans that they met in San Francisco. So in order to get the seeds of the Buddha way planted in America, both Katagiri Roshi and Suzuki Roshi jumped in and did what they had to do beyond their likes and dislikes and emotional preferences. Because they jumped in, many people were able to begin a life of Zen practice. So warm-hearted practice is based on the realization that whatever we meet is our own life. When this is clearly realized, then an attitude of respect, kindness, and tenderness comes up. To live with this attitude of kindness is a life of joy, and this joy is not the usual idea of joy. This usual idea of joy is the joy of satisfying our desires, or the joy of anticipating some happy event. But this is not the usual idea of joy. Once when I was in elementary school in the 5th grade, we were told that in a couple of weeks we're going to get out of school and go to the circus. And this was, for the next 2 weeks, we were joyfully anticipating this wonderful time when we'd get out of school and go see the circus. And, at recess, we'd all talk about, it'll be so great when we go to the circus. Oh, man, that'd be so wonderful. So, but when the day came and we went to the circus, it wasn't that great. They I don't know. We looked at each other and we were thinking, I don't know. it's okay, but it's not the wonderful event we thought it would be, except for one thing. And this was when the trained pigs came out. And all of us, we've been bored by the rest of the circus, but when the trained pigs came out, it was absolutely hilarious. And the hilarious thing about the trained pigs was how very poorly trained they were. We couldn't believe these trained pigs out there. And we were all just in hysterics. But if we had known beforehand, 2 weeks earlier, that the highlight of our trip to the circus was going to be seeing these poorly trained pigs, and it's doubtful if we would have looked forward to it with such joyful anticipation. And when I was in 8th grade, I had a metal shop teacher named Mr. Blanchard, and we called him Mr. B. And Mr. B really loved Fridays. He used to call it Joy Supreme Day. And on Friday, he would say to all us boys, "What day is it today, boys?" And then he would have us answer him in unison, "It's Joy Supreme Day, Mr. B." And Mr. B really loved Fridays. I mean, and he very quickly learned that he'd be much more lenient in grading your metal shop project if you turned it in on Friday. If you turn it in on some other day, he might look at it and say, "Boy, this is pretty sloppy work here. You better do this over." Or, "What were you thinking here? This is really bad." But if you turned it in on Friday, you'd be more likely to say, "I like the freestyle way you did this. It shows real spontaneity, good going." But I don't know what Mr. B had going on the weekends, but it must have been pretty good, because he really loved Fridays, Joy Supreme Day. But the joy of warm-hearted practice is beyond the idea of joyfully anticipating going to the circus or joyfully anticipating the weekend like Mr. B would. The joy of warm-hearted practice is the joy of seeing that we're living inseparably from all beings, and that all beings are mutually assisting each other. This is the joy of realizing that every moment is an opportunity to express our gratitude to others. So what time is it? Oh, I got a little time, yeah. So as practice is to fully participate in this life where we're living inseparably from all beings, and in doing so, we can really help ourselves and help others and really live a wholehearted, helpful, joyful life. So I have a few little stories about Suzuki Roshi. And from these stories, I think you can see he had a kind of a lighthearted approach to life. I can maybe see a little of this joyfulness in his way of life. Once a student asked Suzuki Roshi, "Why do you have 40-minute Zazen periods when most Zen teachers in America have only 30? My legs really hurt when I sit for 40 minutes. Won't you consider having 30-minute periods, at least in sesshin?" Suzuki replied, "That's very interesting. I've been thinking that we should have 50-minute periods." After a long pause, he added, "But maybe we can compromise. Let's make it 40 minutes. You like playing around with people like that. At a question session after Suzuki Roshi had given a lecture, a student asked, What should a Zen practitioner do with his spare time? Suzuki at first looked perplexed and repeated the phrase, spare time? He repeated it again and then began to laugh uproariously. I went in for my meeting with Suzuki Roshi during sesshin. At that time, my main purpose was to get him to approve of me. I told him how I was trying hard to do the right thing. He listened carefully without judgment. And he said, "You get a gold star." A young woman asked Suzuki Roshi after one of his talks, "Roshi, sometimes when I'm trying to decide what to do, I ask myself, in this case, what would Suzuki Roshi do? Should I continue that practice?" And Suzuki Roshi answered, "Then should I also ask myself, what would Suzuki Roshi do?" So these are just some little stories about him. And there's when we were fundraising at the monastery at Tassajara, there was a benefit put on to raise funds to raise money to raise the funds, and they called it a Zenefit, and a lot of the San Francisco bands came and put on performances in Golden Gate Park, and one of the bands was Big Brother and the Holding Company. And then Janis Joplin was she was the head singer there, and Suzuki Roshi was there, and he was waving to everybody and just dispensing good vibrations everywhere. And after Janis Joplin had finished her set, she and Suzuki Roshi stood on the stage holding hands and waving at everybody. I didn't witness this myself, but a friend of mine who was there told me about it. So anyway, these are some stories that I had. I thought these stories might be more interesting than some of my pithy, turgid lectures that I frequently give. Oh gosh, I guess it's almost time to quit, but do you have any questions to ask? Or any? Yes, hi, good to see you. I was kind of a weekend hippie. I had a job and I didn't beg for food or anything, but I was very much in agreement with the objectives of the hippie lifestyle. And they call people like that who supported themselves, but yet were still sympathetic weekend hippies. Mm-hmm. And I fit that category. Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming today. And so anyway, have a good rest of the day, and thank you all very much.